The following story takes place in the year 1989. I had a friend named Donovan, but we often just called him Big Don because of how muscular he was and the respect he had from everyone. He lived in Tacoma, Washington, and whenever I came in from Los Angeles I would visit him. I didn't know that this would be my last time visiting before I was kicked out of the state because of the crackdowns on out-of-towners. Big Don was always into something, and him and I would go lowriding together. If we weren't on 23rd and Sheridan in Tacoma, we'd head to Seattle and hang out on Rainier Avenue. If in Los Angeles, we'd be on Florence or South Hoover Street, or maybe Crenshaw, and everyone liked Donovan with few exceptions. I arrived in Tacoma and was brought up to date with the comings and goings of things there. I was in the Hilltop neighborhood, and it had been on an episode of 48 Hours, as now having more crime per capita than Compton. This put the area under far more police surveillance, and the crime that had been brought by the importation of Los Angeles gangs put the whole area under the spotlight. When I finally met up with Big Don on 8th and L Street, he reached out and shook my hand and we embraced. Big Don looked at me and said, "It's been a long time, man." He looked at me and smiled, full of energy. I knew he was happy to see me because he was as much of a car fanatic as I was, and we had similar tastes with respect to sports. I saw a small lesion on his forehead just under his hairline and pointed it out to him. Big Don chuckled. "Oh, that's nothing, man, just a bump, probably from fighting. I've been really out here scrapping the past 2 weeks." Big Don was known as a fighter. He loved to mix it up on the streets, toe-to-toe fights or 2-on-1. It made no difference to him. He worked out like an athlete and rarely drank or smoked, so he had good cardio. My other friend Lorenzo was also there, and I hadn't seen him in about 4 months. Judging by how he was dressed, he was coming up in the world too. He had a tow truck business and he would do 12-hour days but bring in the cash. During this time and in areas like Tacoma, the fastest and best way to make money was to get involved with the fast drugs trade. The war on drugs was in full swing, and the crack epidemic had turned parts of states like Washington, Oregon, California, and Nevada into war zones. The money being made was immense and no one could foresee this ever ending. So much money was coming in, people had bankrolls still shrink-wrapped from the bank. Man, there was so much money flowing. Big Don wasn't the one to miss out on money. He'd transferred to this trade after being involved in some of the worst gang wars in the history of Washington state. He was a member of the Hilltop Crips but was trying to reduce his participation and back away from that life. He was using incremental steps, no shootings, no being at the regular gang functions. He was still a member. Definitely still a member. But he was moving towards becoming an inactive gang member. Lorenzo and I squeezed our way into Big Don's El Camino lowrider and listened intently as he talked about his life and how it was time to move forward from the gang situation and that it was a dead-end road. He narrated to us and we nodded along as he mentioned how many funerals he and I had been to and the senselessness of this madness. Big Don confided in us when he said, "I've got to get out of this mess. I've put some cash away, paid off my mom's mortgage. She's all I got. After this I'm moving and shifting to somewhere without all this stuff. Maybe Enumclaw, I don't know, maybe Snohomish. But no more here, not ever." Some weeks later, while I was at Lorenzo's house, I got a chaotic call with crying on the other end of the phone. "What the hell is going on?" A woman's voice called out, "You've got to come! You've got to come now! It's Don! He's really sick! You just gotta get here, get over here!" Lorenzo and I jumped into his car and sped over to the address they gave. And it was the hospital. This has gotta be the wrong place, it's gotta be. Lorenzo's pager went off and we went to the payphone to call the number back. The other end of the phone spoke up and it was a woman's voice. "No," the voice assured us, "it was definitely the right place. We need to go to the front desk and ask for Don and give his room number." We hung up, went inside and did as instructed. We had all types of scandalous thoughts going through our mind as we waited in the elevator and each floor dinged. Who did this? Did Don know their name? Was he shot? Stabbed? How will we retaliate? Don had said he wanted out of the gang life. Maybe someone got to him before he could make good on the promise he gave us in the car weeks ago. When the elevator doors swung open, we made a brisk walk to the hall desk and the nurse directed us to his room. There was Don, laid up in the hospital bed. He looked to be asleep, but he had no wounds. No stab wounds, no gunshot wounds. Had this been an attempt to take his own life? This did run in Don's family. Both his father and elder sister had died at their own hands. But Don? No way. We heard a voice call out behind us. "Gentlemen, are you friends of Donovan?" Lorenzo and I both spun around at the same time to catch a glimpse of the doctor. We laid our eyes on a short, stocky, slightly balding man with smiling eyes looking at us behind his thick spectacles. He gently waved us outside into the narrow hallway, where he pulled out a clipboard and kept an eerie, almost melancholy silence while organizing some papers on it. Lorenzo was impatient, so he blurted out as courteously as he could. "Lorenzo, what's wrong with Don?" The doctor looked up and nodded solemnly before answering, then he began, and this ended our world as we knew it. As he spoke, he talked about platelets, blood levels, T-cells, white blood cells, all this terminology. The doctor went through all this information in details with the grim efficiency I know he'd been taught in medical school. My mind began to spin, and I leaned against the wall for support. I leaned slightly so that I could look more macho. I didn't want anyone to know how truly overwhelmed I was in the moment. Lorenzo kept looking down at the floor and up again as if he was literally drinking the information the doctor was giving, going underwater and then coming back up to take another swig. But both of us knew this language and had heard it before. We'd seen the commercials, heard the school presentations. This was the big disease with the little name. The letters people even feared to spell out. AIDS. It was a death sentence. People whispered it in respectful silence. You didn't even joke around about it. The doctor looked at us sympathetically, and then back at his clipboard. The doctor said, "Seeing as you gentlemen are here and there is absolutely no one listed on the next of kin, perhaps you would like to help with Donovan's EOL care." We looked at each other and back at the doctor. The doctor responded, "Oh, end-of-life care. Sorry, we're so used to using shop talk here. There is no one on Don's end-of-life care list or next of kin, so perhaps you gentlemen would do so. I mean, who else would—" The smiling eyes he had went away, and they became dark and sinister. His smile no longer looked friendly, but twisted and dark. A nurse went in with a yellow hazardous materials suit and made checks on our friend. In fact, looking around, I noticed most of the people around us, with the exception of the doctor, were wearing some kind of suit, visor, or protective gear. We and the doctor were the odd ones out. He saw us reflecting on the state of things and sought to put us at ease. The doctor said, "There is a lot of old wives' tales, fears around this, but it's not like this is some plague. This is transmitted through very measurable means. We should all be fine. So, will you be assuming next of kin care?" Lorenzo was the least in shock of the two of us, so he spoke. Lorenzo said, "Yeah, go ahead and put us down for the care. Let's do it." And so it began. Every day we'd go up to the hospital and help Don to get around and move from his bed to the bathroom and back again, feeding him and checking his clipboard with the nurses that came in and out. They looked at us disapprovingly for not wearing protective gear. We called the only person we knew that Don had in his life, the woman who'd called us in the first place to tell us about him, his mother. We told her that Don needed her this time more than any, and she exploded at us. Don's mother told us about how she was not risking getting this disease, how we still didn't even know how it's transmitted and that it was up to us if we wanted to risk our lives, but she wanted to live. She tried to garner our sympathy by saying, "You understand that, don't you boys? It's not like he was going to live a long life. Look at the life he's involved with, maybe this is the best way for him." I slammed the phone down in disgust. Her callous and cruel attitude not only displayed the hard-heartedness of the 80s, but also something else. Fear and ignorance. You need to understand something. In the 80s, few people knew the reality of this disease. The news was no help, claiming that they didn't know whether it was airborne, transmitted by just exposure, or even drinking from the same cup as someone else. These irresponsible reports had people avoiding school, not playing sports together, and not touching cups or plates of strangers for fear that maybe they too could catch this new cancer that destroyed people in mere moments. Lorenzo and I knew better, having been to the library and read up that this could only be transmitted through intravenous needle sharing, risky sex, and polluted blood transfusions. But our friends didn't know these facts. We had to lie to all our friends and family about where we were going every day. As it became so frequent, they started to think that we were towing cars together and maybe starting up a new business on the side. This rumor was convenient enough for us, so we let them run with it. We'd worked out how Don had contracted it. He was no drug user, he was a straight male, and he'd had no blood transfusions. It must have been through unprotected intercourse. Don would often be visited at his house by people seeking drugs. They would pay and he'd hand it over. If they didn't have money, he'd accept items like VCRs, televisions, radios, cars, car stereos. There were times you'd see beautiful women that came through and they'd run out of money to pay. So, they'd offer themselves in exchange for the rock cocaine. This wasn't for money, it was for the drugs. We called these types of girls strawberries. And Don had definitely had his share. And this was the outcome. Now everything started to fit together. The lesion on his forehead, the sweat he broke on a cold day, and the slight breathlessness he had walking with us to his car and getting in it. He'd had it then. He'd probably had it for a long time. We'd thought maybe it was hay fever or asthma, but he'd already contracted it. Now he was full-blown. Day by day, caring for him, we saw his weight dramatically drop, and he lost the ability to speak and control his bowels. Big Don was no more. He was skinny, frail, brittle-boned. One day I was holding him in just my one hand while trying to administer some medication. I felt a splash on the floor hit my sneakers and looked down. He had involuntarily emptied his entire bowels. He looked up at me. I just nodded at him as if to say, "I know, man. It's not your fault. You're okay. We're not gonna tell anyone." That night before we left, Lorenzo and I had a long talk about Don. We were using words like him and he rather than his name. To understand why I need to tell you what we were talking about. Don's decline was so rapid and severe, Lorenzo and I had come up there that day with our guns tucked into our waistband. We had talked at length about how possible it would be to get Don in a wheelchair, out of the hospital, into our car and perhaps over to Puyallup or some area, and give him a merciful ending. We walked through all the scenarios of explaining his death. Perhaps we could say we found him. Taking his life was not out of the question. Remember his father and elder sister, or an accident, or we could give him a fatal dose of medication. We're not proud of these conversations, but as his friends that day when he looked at us while his bowels emptied out, had brought us to a new phase in our friendship. We didn't want this to be the end, not like this. But the more we talked, the more we looked at options, the more our plans fell apart due to security, police presence, and getting him out of the hospital. We had to abandon the plan. One week we came to the hospital and that little doctor told us that Don had been moved to another location. We followed the elevator and then the winding halls it led to until we reached hospice care. Wait, what? Isn't that for the old and dying? That's at least what I'd heard growing up. Once inside, we saw Don. He had been seated by himself in a wheelchair. Most of his hair had fallen out and what was left was gray. His skin was ashen and so thin, you could see the bones in his skull and his eyes were sunken in. He moaned, smiled slightly and looked up at us. I don't think he recognized us. We looked at each other, sat down and cried long tears. Don was gone. That burnt-out, shot-to-hell shell was still there, but the man inside that we'd known, with so many aspirations and dreams of making it out, he was gone. He was extinguished. It must have taken us 5 or 10 minutes to regain our composure. We put our arms around each other and just sobbed while looking at the shell of Don, which barely recognized us. 2 weeks later, when we came to visit Don, we were told that he was dead. The nurse said it in a fashion that signaled her relief. Again, this was the 80s. No one wanted to deal with death like this at all from this disease. We tried to query about getting the body, when it could be released, and about planning a funeral, but she waved us off. The nurse said, "No, that's not gonna happen. He'll be cremated at a facility once the necessary safeguards have been put in place. You boys have been through a lot. It's time for you to get on with your lives." And in that moment, she showed us that little bit of humanity through her fear, and that was it. The rest of the things connected to Don moved like a blur. His mother, who had turned her back on him after he'd paid the mortgage and set her up, spun his death as he had taken his own life, and his cremation was for closure. He had a good turnout at his funeral. People wept, but Lorenzo and I were numb and stiff. Those moments that Lorenzo and I shared together with Don were special. We got to take care of our friend. It also drew Lorenzo and I closer together as friends. We had this secret that we both knew we had to keep for our personal safety. All these years later, I still look back on it and having reflected know that I did the right thing. The best you can do for a friend in need in a dire situation like that is just to be there. We started 1989 with Don and by the year's end, he was gone. I miss you, Big Don. If you enjoy these videos and what we do here, subscribe to the High Class Gear channel, give us a like, and hit the notification bell so you always get updates on new content every week. Stay safe out there.